Okay, Savio, we are live.
And we go. We are moving. All right. So then, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to our speaker and our guests directly from Nigeria, but especially to Professor Julia Hüttner, who's in Vienna. And good morning to Brazilians who are here with us. So this is one more meeting of our ELF Brazil group. And today we have the great pleasure of having Dr. Julia Hüttner with us, who's going to be talking a little bit about the relationship between ELF and CLIL. Before I pass on the word to Julia, I'd like to talk a little bit about her. So, Julia, first of all, thank you very much again for accepting this invitation. It's a great pleasure having you with us. Of course, this group knows a lot about the ELF work done at the University of Vienna, especially because of Barbara Zeidelhofer and Ud Smith and also you. So, so I have a few things to say about you. So if you want to compliment, they'll be fine. This is a very informal meeting. So whatever we discuss here would be fine. So Dr. Julia Hüttner is professor of the University of Vienna in the department of, let me see if I pronounce it correctly, Anglistik und Amerikanistik. So it probably yes. Anglo and American Studies, right?
Yeah, English and American Studies. Yeah.
English and American Studies, something like this. And but she was also a professor for 9 years. She was an associate professor of modern languages at the University of Southampton. So someone who was very present together with the great fellow teachers and researchers like Jennifer Jenkins, Will Baker, Alessia Kogo at the University of Southampton. So Julia has, she says here that her research focuses on foreign language learning teaching and currently addresses two major areas. First, CLIL, which is content and language integrated learning, which is something that is becoming sort of popular in Latin America, including Brazil, and EMI, English Medium Instruction, where a lot of her research focuses on classroom interactions. Secondly, she also looks at teacher development, particularly ESP, and teacher beliefs. So past research, she also focused on genre use in English for academic purposes and English for specific purposes, and on EFL classroom interactions. So she says here that these topics are still close to her heart. Is that right, Julia?
Yeah, yes.
Right. So Julia has also edited a couple of books, including Theory and Practice in EFL Teacher Education, Bridging the Gap, and also has written several chapter books and articles, especially the one I asked her, I kindly asked her to discuss today with us, which is the chapter 38 from the handbook of English as a lingua franca, and she contributed with the topic English and content and language integrated learning. So this is probably her presentation will be based on this chapter. So people in the group have had access to the material. Also Professor Mustafa. So then this is the text she's going to be concentrated on. But of course, we can take other questions depending on how, or maybe people who are more familiar with her work. Anyway, thank you very much again, Julia. The floor is yours. Okay. And we are very glad having you here with us. Thank you very much.
Right. Well, thank you, Savio, for these really kind words and also for the kind invitation. And I mean, part of me felt, well, it would be really nice to actually go to Brazil but then I know I wouldn't go for one talk. And I think it's actually quite wonderful that we can meet with colleagues from Brazil, colleagues from Nigeria, and have a discussion on something, even if it's from various time zones and various offices. So I'm very grateful. I also, as you mentioned, kind of all my research has been done in Europe. And I think we're always kind of a little bit familiar with our own classrooms, our own educational environments. And so I'm really interested also in hearing from your perspectives. If you say, well, actually in our classrooms, this is not true, or this is similar, right? Because education is something very, at the same time, we agree on very many issues of education, why we do it, what's important. There are a lot of agreements. On the other hand, one classroom, even within a country, even a small country like Austria, never mind a large country, a classroom in a small village will be different from a classroom in a big city, right? So I'm really kind of, if you say, well, actually, this does not resonate with my experience, please tell me. I'm really genuinely very interested to hear. Okay, as Savio said, I'm going to talk about CLIL and ELF. My actual main research focus is on CLIL. I'm very much an educational researcher, but I seem to have followed ELF researchers or mothers of ELF in my career. So from Vienna to Southampton and back. So I've always been very much aware of it and I find it a very crucial part of thinking about what we do as English educators at the moment. Okay, if there's any problem in hearing me, understanding me, seeing my slides, etc., just let me know. Don't feel shy about interrupting. Questions, I think, maybe easier to keep until the end, but if there's something in understanding, you can also interrupt. I'm not very worried about interruptions, right? Okay. So let's see if this works. So, I mean, you're all researchers of ELF. I don't need to give a definition, but just to remind us of it. So taking Barbara Seidelhofer's one, any use of English among speakers of different first languages. For English is a communicative medium of choice and often the only option, right? Doesn't have to be the only option, but very often it is. On the other hand, content and language integrated learning, or CLIL, is an educational approach where we teach non-language subjects, so mathematics, history, geography, whatever, through a medium of a foreign language, and most typically that is English, to students in mainstream education. So not in elite schools, not in special schools, but just part of mainstream education. Okay, so English is important in both of these. But if you look at kind of ELF, you usually have no other language option. And like our meeting now, kind of, we could have spent 20 minutes trying to find out what other languages we share in our group. And maybe we would have found another one that we can all manage. But we assume that it's the only language or it's the best language we can cope with, right? Maybe if we meet every week for years, we will find out that, I don't know, maybe we could try Italian and that will work as well or whatever. What's also really important in an ELF interaction, language development or learning is not the point, right? We want to do something, achieve something either in our professional lives or just kind of as friendship or relationship work, right? So we use language for something, okay. And in CLIL, I know there is at least one other language available to all because I'm in a mainstream school. So if I'm in an Austrian school, I know I could switch to German because everybody in the class will know enough German, whether it's their first language or not, right? In our cities, for about 40–50% of the students will not be their first language, but it will be a strong language that they have. And also as a society, we've agreed, we're in school, we're talking in school in order to learn, right? And in CLIL, both, whatever it is, history or sports or chemistry, but also English. So it's important to also highlight that there are different phenomena, different ways of looking at using English for very different purposes. But I think I share a very old observation by Mohan, so that very often as teachers, we forget kind of this integration of language and content, right? So any content that I want anybody to understand in an educational context, very often also outside, I need language to make that accessible. I need language for them to show me their understanding. And at the same time, I can't teach a foreign language or any language without talking about something, right? Even if it's kind of everyday topics and I talk about my family or my likes and dislikes, but I need something to talk about, right? And sometimes in our separations in education of saying, okay, we have a mathematics class, and this is only about mathematics, and the language class is only about language, but I also need language to understand the mathematics task. And I need to have something to talk about. And I think it's important to keep in the back of our minds. And I think even though it's an old contribution, it's worth looking at. So if you look at CLIL, even within Europe, we have to say there's not a CLIL pedagogy, right? Other than saying I teach a content subject through a foreign language, there is no other pedagogy. So if I teach maths, it will be very different from sports. If I teach in Spain, it might be very different to teaching in Finland, depending on the educational backgrounds, right? And there has been always in CLIL a tension whether I say, well, maybe this is just a form of language teaching like task-based learning or communicative language teaching. And you have lots of research actually, especially in the early phases of CLIL, that basically just looks at language learning outcomes and says, okay, we have 400 children who were in a CLIL program, how much better or different is their English proficiency after that than to kids who weren't, right? And the other view of it is to say, well, it's really trying to do something different. It's trying to focus again on the integration, the combination that we always have between language and content learning, and really by having a foreign language highlights that. In the European context, the language used typically is English, and that makes CLIL also different in Europe from other bilingual approaches, because it's not about saying I'm learning a language of my community, right? I mean, a bilingual community and I learn the other language, for instance. It's really kind of a foreign language. I say it with a little bit of hesitation, because if you look at typical teenagers in Europe now, and probably not only in Europe, English is present in their online world, and their online world plays a lot of role in their lives. So a PhD, Marlene Schwarz, recently did a study in Vienna, which, okay, is a big city, with older teenagers, and they spend an average of 5 hours online every day, right? But kind of looking at this integration would be the other view of CLIL. We also have a diversity in terms of, I know from, like everywhere, right? So from Europe, kind of Latin America seems similar, right? And I'm sure Europe seems similar from Latin America. If you're in a continent, of course, you're very much aware of the differences within it. And in Europe also, just as a reminder, so there are regular surveys that ask people to say, well, how confident do you feel to have a conversation in your strongest foreign language, which is usually English? Or are you confident to have a conversation, not a professional, just any conversation? And in the Netherlands, which is the highest, 90% will say they're confident to have that. In the Czech Republic, only about 27%. And there's a lot in this range of 25% roughly. So you also, CLIL is happening sometimes in countries where the teachers, the parents, and also the students feel quite confident about their English, or in countries where they really say, well, there's a lot of learning to happen. And of course, yeah, every classroom is unique. We have different ages, different subjects, etc. So CLIL is not one thing. And I think you're all aware as ELF researchers, ELF is not one thing either, right? So depending on what's happening, we're not talking about a code or anything, right? So there's two kind of fairly fluid concepts that are meeting one another. So one way I have used in the past, and I find for myself helpful of trying to make sense of CLIL or other educational programs, is to actually look at it as a language policy event, because it's not language policy in the sense of national language policies, but there are also kind of similar constraints in that I have, on the one hand, I don't know, can you actually see my cursor if I move it? Yeah. So on the one hand, you have language management. So you have the actual laws or regulations that come into place that also say in Austria, for instance, these are the languages that are taught as foreign languages, right? And for instance, Portuguese is not one, but Spanish is, right? So there are some political decisions made, right? And then we have the beliefs, which includes beliefs about learning. So how do people learn? But also everything related to language ideology, right? Which language is an important language? Which language should my child learn, right? Which language is easy? Which language is difficult? All these things. And then, of course, we have what happens in the classroom, so the actual practices. And if you look at it as a system, if I move something here in the regulations, how people view this program, how people practice it will change. If people, for instance, if I try to introduce CLIL with a target language that people feel will not benefit their children, then other things would also change, right? It's a dynamic system, it will integrate. So if I change one part, other parts will also change, right? And that's what I like about Smolsky's conceptualization. It shows us a bit the interrelatedness of things, and that I can't just say, well, I look at language policy and I ignore what actually happens in the classroom or ignore how people feel about this. Because in all countries, I think, at least in my country, you can also ignore regulations as a teacher. I mean, you can live quite happy lives and work beside regulations. Okay, so if we look at, and so just very briefly, I want to look at these three areas and see where does CLIL and ELF, where do they touch one another, right? And so in language management in Europe, it's very interesting because, how shall I put this? As a bit of a taboo, right? Everybody knows that actually when we talk about multilingualism in Europe, we're talking about certainly multilingualism at regional level, at local level, but always with the main language of international communication, which is English, right? All the official policy statements are neutral regarding language. So the European Commission says the goal is for European citizens to be fluent in their L1 and 2 union languages, right? And just the fact that you know, the UK having left the European Union, we're kind of lucky to still have Ireland in the European Union, because otherwise English would not be a union language anymore. And even if Ireland, which I don't think they will, I hope not, but if the Republic of Ireland said, well, we're leaving tomorrow, the European Union, English would still have a role in Europe, right? It's not because it's a union language. So it's not formally acknowledged that English is special, but it is recognized as special by all kind of life practices. And that means also we have English as dominant in CLIL programs. So Ute Smith and I we've worked together closely for many years, and we still work together closely. At one point we tried to formulate how we think this relation works with CLIL and the position of English, and we feel that CLIL are a range of local responses to the global position of English. So depending on my context, so if English in my country is fairly weak as a foreign language, I might have CLIL that focuses a lot on language development, because that might be the local response. If CLIL happens in a country which is already quite strong in general, English as a foreign language, it might focus more on professional, vocational aspects. But it is a response to a perceived and also probably factual dominance of English, right? And that kind of course, might be locally diverse, but English is not actually outside the digital world. It's not part of an established community language repertoire. So we've got a bit of a tension here. In beliefs, it's a lot more coherent. So beliefs are very clear. If you ask any stakeholders in CLIL, so parents, students, teachers, head teachers, future employers, kind of, it's not even a discussion. So the official policy that it's about any kind of multilingualism does not enter. Everybody will say it's about English because school leavers need English, right? To be internationally successful, to be professional. Sort of the survey, large-scale surveys supported, like the Eurobarometer, which asks all adult Europeans in about 10-year intervals, all sorts of questions, or a sample, obviously. About 80% view English as the most useful language to learn. But if we look at more detailed data, we can also see that in interviews from teachers and students in CLIL programs, sort of the whole issue, and I'll come back to that, of correctness, what is correct English changes a bit. So the beliefs about what English are a bit challenged, right? And the relevance for English is also confirmed in individual interviews, even with quite young children. So children age 11, 12 will say English is important for me, where you might say objectively in their lives is not very important because their lives are still very local. Also importantly, most teachers interviewed feel a confidence in using English for English for CLIL, sorry. So I can manage, my English is good enough for this, right? And most participants in the contexts I work with see a difference between CLIL and English language classrooms. So, one boy in a study once said, well, the English language classroom is where you talk about hobbies, and the CLIL classroom is where you talk about technology, right? It's one of my favorite quotes, because it really showed, this is what it's about, right? And so kind of position of English as separate, as special, and also of English very much in the realm of professional English, partly also lingua franca English, is very strong in language beliefs, right? And that kind of justifies CLIL for most participants. That's why we do it, right? In language practices, both CLIL and ELF are multilingual practices, and Jenny Jenkins has a few years ago written about the fact that, obviously, of course, ELF is multilingual, but we also activate languages. And CLIL is also a bilingual, at least, or multilingual educational program. You share kind of that the focus is on arriving at a shared meaning, right? So shared understanding, shared meaning, both in ELF interactions and in CLIL. Correctness, as I mentioned before, is something which is given a slightly, so in ELF interactions, correctness usually only matters in the sense of clarification of meaning, kind of to very roughly generalize. And in CLIL, that it's a bit more complex, so that is kind of clearly something that comes up. But there is also a clear notion of disciplinary correctness, and that can happen at all levels. So a biology teacher might say, well, I want this exact term because it's important for biology. And if we're talking about epithelial, I want you to use the word. Teacher might also say, I want you to be able to pronounce it correctly, to spell it correctly, but usually not because, or primarily because a native speaker would pronounce it in that way, but because a biologist would. And that sometimes seems a bit splitting hairs, but I think it's an important distinction. So for the CLIL teacher, it's about whether an economist or a biologist or a historian would say it like that if they use English. And it's not about whether it's native-like or not native-like, right? But there is also great variation. So sometimes teachers will kind of correct things, not randomly, but things that they notice or things that they find out. Because a lot of CLIL teachers are not trained specifically to teach CLIL, right? So they're also acting on past experience, right? What's quite important, as I already said in the beginning, in the multilingual practices in CLIL, I know what the language repertoire is. So I have one other language that I can definitely relate to as a resource, and I know which language that is. In ELF interactions, often I would have to find out which it is and might work with, kind of activating a lot more of the multilingual resource. In CLIL, it's usually kind of one language that's immediately homed in on. And then kind of the interesting thing is, of course, if you're a child learning about biology, whether in your L1 or in English, you're going to learn terms that you probably don't use in your family environment, because very often we have either we don't talk about certain aspects or we have more informal words for that, right? And teachers are very much aware of that, so that very often both languages are targeted in CLIL. So it's not just kind of that the L1 or the other language is a resource, but it's also a legitimate target, right? And kind of learners very often kind of show an awareness of their language learning in these disciplinary areas, right? So they show that they're very aware of that. And I've got one example. So those are, so it's obviously pseudonyms. They're kids who at the time of recording were 16 and they were doing economics at school. And what's in bold is in German, and I've given the English translation in curly brackets. So Eva first says, wie sage ich das, Geldpolitik? So how do I say that, monetary policy? And Miriam suggests the English term, monetary policy. Simon comes in immediately, monetary policy. And then Simon has an interesting comment. It says, wer hätte gedacht, dass ich das jemals weiß? Who'd have thought that I'd ever know that? And they check what monetary policy is, right? So you can see that they're aware of the learning. I've also got some examples where they play a bit with the language. And it's kind of interesting that they're often kind of working with also both the terms in both languages, right? So it's about kind of not just any English, but specific English that they're looking at, right? And it's not kind of an ELF, what should I say? It's not ELF in the sense that kind of having made sense is achieved, because they do that with the German already. They have the target of having it in English, but they show awareness that I learned something here, right? And there are quite a few examples like this. But kids also make fun, which is something that's very well reported also in ELF interactions. So that's an example of the paper that you might have read. So it's in a Swedish context, and Contio and Sylvain reported, and they're older teenagers, young men who are interacting, and they use the Swedish word men, which means but in Swedish. And they go, men, yeah, men, but, so, but what? And then Ken says men in blue, right? So it's kind of switched because they are in their engineering workshop, so they're in vocational training, so they're men in blue, right? It's also interesting because they know the associations, etc. But at some point they just play with it, right? So the languages are activated for learning purposes, like in the first example, but also just for fun, right? And the latter is something that's very similar to some ELF interactions. The former one, maybe not so much. I don't think it's something that would not happen at all, but not in the context of saying, oh, I have learned this, but it's kind of achieving. And if we look now kind of, so there are some points of contact in the sense that the position of English is what gives acceptance to CLIL, right? I want to get mainstream students, mainstream teachers of other contents, subjects who are not English teachers typically, and parents on board to say we're going to do something which at first sight for parents seems this will make life harder for my child, because learning physics is bad enough already, so now I have to learn it through a foreign language. So the reason that I get support for that is because English is really perceived as the most important language, and also kind of as something which has relevance in the professional world, in the world of work, in kind of future, maybe future academic work, but it is something there. In the actual, so there's a connection there in terms of reason for it. In the actual practices, some are very different, but some are quite similar in terms of some of the meaning-making processes, but also some of the playfulness of a kind of fairly confident bilingual situation, confident in the sense that you don't feel I have to be correct all the time, I have to be serious all the time, but can play with it as well, right? Now, what I'd also briefly wanted to tell you about is actually something that is not my own work, but work by Turkish colleagues, but I think it's interesting, so you might as well. You will have heard, I think, about ELF-aware teaching, which Sifakis suggested a while ago, and so kind of very much saying it's about awareness raising. So raising awareness of ELF in terms of what does it mean for language use? What does it mean for instructional practices? And what does it mean for learning, right? Now, my PowerPoint didn't want to do special systems today, so it should have a little addition here. So Yalcin Bayud and Alada, very recently, but it's available online, wrote on what they felt as a triggering effect of CLIL practice on ELF awareness. So they were looking at Turkish primary school teachers who had experience of teaching CLIL. Now, in the Western European context, typically CLIL happens in the content classroom, right? So just in a very banal sense, education is split up that we divide human knowledge into subjects, right? So CLIL, which tries to integrate two, formally has to end up in one of the other. So it's either, if I have CLIL history, schedule, assessment, teachers have to be either history or English or the other foreign language. Now, in most of Europe, CLIL history will be history, right? So it will be taught by the history teacher, the students will get a history grade, and the English is kind of an extra, right? Which is also, I think, where a lot of the disciplinary focus comes from in the example that I showed you earlier on. In Japan, in Turkey, and to my knowledge, also in some countries in Latin America, the focus is more on the language side, so that CLIL history would then happen in the English class. And so the focus would be more there. So in Turkey, kind of these were English teachers, and the CLIL took place in the English classroom. And basically it was a questionnaire interview study that looked at, I mean, they asked many more, but the kind of answers were from 30 primary school teachers. And what they found kind of confirms, I think, or resonates, shall we say, with other findings, that the experience of teaching CLIL increased the confidence of the teachers as users of English, right? They felt, okay, maybe, you know, I'm definitely not native-like, and I don't want to be native-like, but I can talk to these children about science in English, right? Or history in English. And also kind of felt that the experience of teaching CLIL made these teachers more aware of the fact of where English can be used and how it can be used. Like many other studies, they found that their teachers responded or noticed the fact that the CLIL context seemed to be more tolerant of mistakes, of language mistakes, and that seemed to increase the confidence in learners of using English, right? So that I can use English for a purpose without being too worried about making mistakes. And this kind of also Ute and I found in Austrian data, and some students also verbalized and said it's a safe place, right? I can use English if I get it wrong, it doesn't really matter, because it's kind of okay if I switch to German to clarify, it's okay if I make mistakes. In the English classroom, even though kind of saying in our context, teachers are very aware of different correction strategies, etc., but the students certainly feel that there's more of a demand for kind of correctness in the sense of really conforming to existing norms. And one of the students that they interviewed also said that, you know, kind of their students now have a real reason to use English in the classroom, just like they do outside of the classroom. So you're not just, and that is in many regular English classrooms, that's a problem reported by teachers. So if you think of a typical task in a language classroom, and you have like, I don't know, you have an imaginary job advertisement and 5 imaginary candidates, you have to rank them and say which one is the best. Okay, you have a negotiation, but actually there is nothing at stake. Because if you don't agree, you don't agree. If you don't agree, but say you agree, it really doesn't matter. In a content class, of course, much more is at stake, because if you say you have to solve, I don't know, a problem in mathematics or a chemistry task, or get a chemistry experiment right, there is something at stake for the negotiation, right? So something actually kind of the agreement I reached through the foreign language matters. And this kind of real reason, I mean, real is always a difficult word to use, right? What is real, what is authentic? But there is, so I like to think about stakes in negotiation. And sometimes, you know, also in ELF interactions, sometimes there is nothing at stake, really, right? If I just communicate with somebody and basically the only thing I want to transmit is that I am a friendly human being, and I hope you're also a friendly human being, then the details don't matter, right? If I'm negotiating, I don't know, the sale of part of a company, the details matter, right? There is more at stake. And we are in a tradition of language teaching where very often kind of we have all sorts of tasks and interactions, but there is never anything at stake, right? And of course, in the protected, and it has to be protected, right? You don't want to let kids blow themselves up in a science class. But the stakes are limited in education, but kind of CLIL pushes students to say, actually, I need to make this work in English because I need to have an agreement. And that seems, and the agreement matters. If we get it right or wrong, we get a good grade or a bad grade in our physics project, right? And that kind of changes a little bit how much effort is involved in actually meaning making. But it's an interesting study, a short paper, and I think it shows how, you know, again, saying CLIL teaching isn't ELF teaching, right? And maybe you cannot teach ELF, but the CLIL teaching changes some perspectives in teachers about what can and cannot be done with English, right? So just quickly to get to a summary. So one important point, because sometimes people also say everything is ELF. And I think education is not ELF. And I think we need to keep them apart, because English as a lingua franca is a sociolinguistic use of English. Education has agreed societal purposes, which are to some degree artificial, right? But they serve greater efficiency in learning. So they're not the same, but they are related in terms of one justifying the other. So actually ELF, or the position of English, the existence of ELF, justifying CLIL and getting its support. If I try to do the same with another foreign language, even a global foreign language like Spanish or French, I would have much bigger problems, right, to get parental support. Some of the practices really resemble one another. So we can see when we move, the further we move into language as something for use, something for meaning making, some functions do seem to be shared, right? So kind of meaning making, use, humor as well. I think the professional, the disciplinary issue is maybe more complex, but might also be something that in ELF research might need to be looked at. So how not having a native speaker norm does not equate not having a norm, right? If I write an academic paper, I'm still expected to conform to certain norms. Maybe people don't mind whether I use metaphorical language in the same way, or whether all my third-person essays are there or not. But there are certain norms that are expected. If I write a lab report in chemistry, a certain form is expected. There is a norm, that a professional norm that people agree to. And language somehow plays a role, but we really don't know very much about how this works. what's interesting, you might know Dernier's motivational, or Dernier Rushioda's motivational concept of the ideal L2 self, so that we motivate ourselves in learning a foreign language by saying, what am I like as an L2 speaker? And I think CLIL also very clearly suggests to students, or makes it possible, shall we say, that they view themselves or their ideal L2 self as an ELF user. It's not somebody who's a tourist in America or a migrant to England primarily, but it's somebody who will use, maybe in their own country, but who will use English as, I don't know, as an engineer or whatever, right? Whatever they imagine to be. And I think kind of these connections, like the general connections between, ELF as a practice and various forms of education with and in English, certainly have some more questions and issues to look at. So that's all from me for today. So I hope it gives you an idea of where I stand. I'm obviously very happy to take questions, answer them if I can, or think about them if I can't answer them. Yes.
Thank you, Julia. You pretty much covered a lot in terms of, of time. And for us who read the chapter, so then of course you couldn't touch everything, but you did a lot. So thank you very much. It was very enlightening, especially because I liked when you started localizing your research in the context. Because as you say, CLIL, we have, a plethora of CLIL experiences in different parts of the world. And I would like to ask you two things, and then I'll pass on to our colleagues here in the room, and then check if we have questions and comments from the audience. But thank you very much. It was very, very clarifying, and I think these points of context, especially for us ELF researchers, are very, very interesting. So one thing that you mentioned in the text that I'd like you to expand a little bit is the role of translanguaging. Even though you sort of mentioned, but of course you didn't name it. But then, because for example, you wrote this chapter around 1718. It was published in 1718. So then I would like to hear from you, how is the debate in terms of translanguaging, the role of translanguaging, including pedagogical translanguage that Senos has been writing about this, pedagogical translanguage and natural translanguage in the classroom. And I'd like you to expand the last paragraph of your text.
Okay. What did
when
I
you
write?
say, I'll read out loud.
Okay.
You say this: practices in CLIL vary enormously, so any conclusions to be drawn from the studies reported here are tentative, which is true. But CLIL does seem to have the potential of being the missing link in English language provision at school between the purely educational and still largely native speaker-oriented ELT classroom and the reality of a professional globalized world where English is of paramount importance and where in many cases this English is English as a lingua franca. I think this is, if you could expand this a little bit, especially for teachers, for example, in Brazil, who've been we've been experiencing, even though it's still let's say restricted to private and elite schools in terms of using CLIL, but I think it would be interesting to hear from you your reality and your experience.
Okay, so if I start with the translanguaging, yes, it's a crucial part of CLIL. And Uta and I have been doing some work on it, are doing some work on it. What we found so far is very so kind of we have CLIL in a way as a bilingual or multilingual space. And depending on teachers, depending on contexts, this multilingualism is more or less acknowledged, more or less fostered. So we've worked with teachers who explicitly said, okay, so we're working, this was the economics teacher where one example was taken and said, okay, it's a really difficult concept in terms of finance, find resources, find 3 resources in German and 3 in English, right? So that actually kind of the idea is that you look at the concept in various languages. Or maybe also other L1s if the teacher is happy to do that, right? A lot of teachers in CLIL in Austria sort of really very consciously code switch. So we say, okay, sometimes flagged, sometimes not. So we'll explain something, I don't know, about physics and momentum and this and that, and say, okay, now maybe this was a bit difficult. We'll look at it again in German, right? Or ask a student and say, can you tell us in German what it was about, to acknowledge that. So very much using translanguaging, a kind of translanguaging in the process of learning, right? So what I think is really crucial to distinguish in educational contexts is what happens when I'm in the process of learning, where as an individual and as a facilitating teacher, I will want my learners to really activate all the resources they have, right? So I'm learning something challenging, cognitively challenging, new, say, use everything you can to get your head around this, right?
Yes.
But then I might say, okay, but now, so we're in this learning part, but then there is also a performance part or a production part where I might say, okay, but now you have understood this, and now I want you to, whatever, present a proof in mathematics and present that in the form that a mathematician would present it, right? And then we're no longer at this, but we kind of want, maybe we want the formula, we want the correct form. And translanguaging so far in the one context that we worked in was very, very much present in this learning part of it, where really it was activated. And I think that's what I think is the beauty of translanguaging as a concept, is that if I now talk to you and it's only in English, right? You could say, well, this is a monolingual English performance, right? If I look at translanguaging, I could say, well, but what about all those sources that I read in preparation in German or in Italian or in other languages? And with translanguaging, this kind of bilingual space of it is more acknowledged, right? So it is a very crucial part of it. It's something that I feel in terms of teacher education, that teachers need a lot more support still to feel confident about, right? So teachers, I think most teachers, most language teachers now feel it's, the L1 or the L1s are no longer taboo, but they're not seen as something that's a real resource. It's a bit like, it's like the emergency airbag in your car, right? So yeah, it's good that it's there, but we won't activate it unless necessary. And I think kind of making that more apparent, that there are at least 2 languages involved, can help teachers. And I mean, we've worked with some very confident teachers, I think, and felt how, and of course there is a movement, right? They want to get the students to the point that they can produce, issue, kind of suitable, whatever, presentations, texts, etc., only in English, right? But to acknowledge the role there. So there is a lot happening there, and I think it's very important. And I think for me, and I mean, I've suggested this, this distinction between learning focused and production focused is very important, because that's also sometimes where, so Uta and I kind of recorded lots of classroom events, so kind of group work of students without the teacher present, student presentations, a teacher talk, etc. And the amount of German, so the amount of the L1 was really massively different, right? Ranging from less than 1% to 70%, right? So it really depends. It's not one event, right? When I'm trying to make sense of something, I act differently than when I'm being assessed on a performance, right? But there is still a lot more work to be done there. I'd also be interested to see what the similarities are then to multilingual ELF practices, because there, of course, there might be less of an opportunity because there usually is not such a strong second language in the interaction, right? So I don't know if that helps.
No, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah.
I just was good. I would like to add just quickly, because I really want the other ones to participate. So do you think, for example, in Austria, of course, everything that you said about translanguaging, you know, in a CLIL context, in an ELT context, so especially if it's an ELF-aware context, so this is perfect. But I'd like to just, out of your experience, how about pedagogical translanguaging? For example, are teachers, you know, aware that they can previously plan for pedagogical translanguaging and take advantage, or they just let it go?
It's a mixture. It's a mixture, to be honest. Also, how the students react to it is one of the points where the CLIL students react most diversely to it. So some CLIL students see it as really positive that the teacher switches. And we've had students who said, you know, this is really infuriating. So finally I get my head around this being in English, and then she switches back to German and then back to English, and I really can't cope, right? Teachers are aware of it and they use it, but very often not so much really as pedagogical translanguaging, but in kind of reserving certain domains for the L1, like administrative stuff typically happens in the L1. So it really depends on teachers. So in those that we've worked with, there were some who were who used both languages very consciously and had a lot of planning in their pedagogical translanguaging. We had some who were really kind of trying for an English-only approach. We had some where it was just completely haphazard and changed from lesson to lesson, right?
You have opposites and also people in the middle, right?
Yeah, no, and I think it has to do with the fact that there is very little guidance, and so teachers just react to what they feel works, right? Or partly what they feel comfortable with, right? And to the second part, so I think all education has a challenge that we want to prepare for life after school or outside of school, right? That doesn't necessarily mean copying the world of work, but it needs some preparation for it. So kind of I also feel like in a way, you know, people saying, I don't know, in ELF, X, Y, Z happens, and this is not what's being taught at school. That to me as an educationalist, that doesn't upset me. My question would be, do people after school cope with this happening, right? If they do, then kind of the task is achieved. I think the advantage of CLIL is that it is very much reducing, maybe it's not the good word, but it positions language very much as a tool for something else. And that is for most people the reality of, I mean, unless kind of people like us who make language our profession, but for most people, language will remain a tool to achieve something else. And CLIL does help to do that. And it does show students that English is not just about reading literature written in English or traveling to countries where English is a first or a second language. And that's not to say that it's that's not to negate the role of ELT, right? Because you know, but it's to show that kind of certainly for some learners, the motivational factors will be about saying, this is relevant for me in my job, even if my job does not include being a language specialist. And many years ago, actually now, Barbara Seidelhofer suggested that, and I think a very good analogy, if you look at English proficiency, like the ability to use a computer, right? I mean, I don't know, but I'm certainly not an IT expert, but I can use a computer for my purposes, and I understand it enough to use it. And that English should be seen as that, and not just as kind of, I learn a foreign language like I might learn French, right? So,
okay, thank you. Professor Abolagi, Juliana, anybody would like to ask Danielle, Julia, comment, questions? Abolagi, tell us give us some insights from Nigeria concerning this, if you can, please.
Okay, thank you, Savio. Thank you for that insightful presentation, particularly your reference to trans language in yeah, I think it's very close to what we do in educational social linguistics, where especially in some language contexts, teachers explore language resources to impact knowledge. Meaning, of course, here in Nigeria, the language policy states the first 3 years of a child, the child should be taught using the language of the immediate environment, a local language. So the first 3 years, the child is taught English as a school subject, not as the language of instruction. But from the 4th year, English will take over as the language of instruction. But that does not mean that the teacher, whether of physics, geography, or other content subjects, should restrict himself or herself to the use of English alone. The classroom teacher at liberty to explore the first languages of the learners to pass his information or knowledge, just to ensure that his set goals are achieved. So I think translanguaging, as we have here, we call it social linguistics. I mean, in social linguistics, we refer to it as code switching, whereby you use English at a point, and then as a teacher, you realize that you're not passing information, and then you switch over to the learner's first language, and the students will go, "Wow, that was what you meant." So there's nothing about that. I think that's a very good idea. I mean, I've had difficulty sometimes pronounce some words, trying to follow the native English way of pronouncing the word. I mean, take for example the word "come," C-O-M-E. It's "come." But in Nigerian English, it's "come." So sometimes we're getting so hyper corrective in the use of English. Sometimes the switch, but by the time now dropped the local variety or the accents of people, then you tune them on. So I think that's a very good idea. My question has to do with ELT and CLIL. So ELT teacher, okay, they have to sometimes address himself and his learners using just the English language. Times, I mean, it's a language class, we know that, but you are teaching learners whose first language is not English. Can the ELT teacher also access the local languages of the learner? Also, coming over to CLIL now, is it possible? Know that the subject teacher is concerned about the content, not the language. Seeing that the learner under CLIL program is also acquiring the English language, as it were, although the language is not the focus of the CLIL program teacher. Is it possible to give such teachers kind of language training in English so that as they teach the content, whether in physics, in chemistry, they are also equipped with a measure of knowledge that will help them directly or indirectly pass on language to the learner? Isn't that possible, so that they're not just restricted? For example, in Nigeria here, our lecture language, the National Union, that is of university, see in the ability to pass knowledge, but the methodology is not there. See, it recommend now that lecturers should go for kind of a crash program on pedagogy methodology. They have the physics lecturer has the content, physics, but the method of passing information, the pedagogy methodology is lacking. Now there is a crash program. So what I'm suggesting is it's possible for teachers on a CLIL program who are only concerned about content to be provided with kind of crash program in English language, so that as they teach the content, they will also be able to pass some language skills in English that will help the learner. So Julia,
okay.
I don't know if Julia got because it was a little.
I think I got quite a bit. I think
yes, Julia.
So we'll see. In terms of the CLIL teacher having English language methodology or pedagogy training, the problem, so that has been done in quite a few contexts. What people found was that sometimes this really did not work, because what you need to find in CLIL is an integration and an integration of methodologies, right? Because if you tell the physics teacher, well, one of the methodologies we use in ELT is role play, the physics teacher might say, well, but it's not something I can do in physics, right? So the approach has to be a bit more careful, and there's lots of people who work exactly on this. So how can I, because CLIL is a dual approach, so because they're learning, so they're still very much seen as language learners and not kind of language users, and it's not an immersion context. So what happens a lot is that there is an awareness of, say, whatever, say I want to teach gravity in physics. I'm not quite sure if that's something I wanted to do. Say I want to teach gravity. The idea would be that as a CLIL teacher, I come up with the objective, which is the objective based on my content knowledge. And then I might say, okay, so what are then the subject-specific terms that these students need to learn? I need to be clear on which they need to learn. I need to be clear, do they just have to understand them? Or have to be clear to produce them, right? Do they need to spell them correctly, etc.? Or do I say it doesn't matter because they'll do that in the L1 again, which I think is a difference to your context, in that they will still have L1 based teaching until they graduate from school, right? And then kind of sort of the big issue is sort of more the, if you want to call it, the general academic language. And that's where teachers, so kind of vocabulary teaching, teachers are usually very open and saying, okay, what are the methodologies? How do I teach new words, etc. What is also very tricky in CLIL is very much to say, how do I teach larger discourse chunks, right? So I don't know, I might need to have a definition, right? So a definition in history will look a particular way, a definition in biology will look slightly different. And getting teachers to say, well, actually, this is also language. Because for us as applied linguists or educational linguists, a lot about genre, a lot about discourse is seen as part of language. Very often for content teachers who are not very aware of language, you know, if you ask a typical chemistry teacher, if you say, well, you know, what's the structure of a lab report, etc., what goes in there, they might just say, well, that's the way you do it, right? And not be aware of the fact that this can be made explicit, this can be verbalized. And if it's maybe slightly different to what you do in the L1, this needs to be verbalized as well. In terms of how much language do CLIL learners learn, which I think was the first question, quite a lot. And there are a lot of studies about it. So where they have the most growth, the biggest advantage is in vocabulary, which is kind of unsurprising in a way, because you're dealing with areas and topics that in a general ELT class you probably won't cover, right? So they have a massive advantage there. They also have, interestingly, advantages in kind of lexicogrammar, right? So actually grammar rather, morphosyntax. They have general kind of advantage in fluency and just amount of language produced, which again seems to correlate a lot with the confidence increase of using it a lot, basically just having more exposure to it. Where not much is happening in CLIL students is about pragmatics, because that's not the topic really, because you're dealing with profession. Pronunciation, again, very varied, but it's usually not something that's focused on, because in a way it doesn't matter, right? Writing is interesting. So generally more improvement in the receptive skills. So they get better in listening and reading than in writing. Speaking is still quite good. Writing varies, and I don't know what it's like in your countries, but say in Austria, there is actually very little writing in non-language subjects. So you write essays in the first language, German, you write essays in English or in other foreign languages. But say in history, very often you just write, you know, have a test and you write a very short answer, right? So writing seems to be a bit the stepchild, right?
Like
but
neglected.
but it's also changing, because sort of we had the findings that writing seems to remain problematic, and so teacher and teacher education programs have reacted, right? One big word of caution, right? So unlike in Nigeria, if I understood you correctly, where all children move to English medium instruction at a certain age, in Europe, up until very recently, CLIL has always been voluntary. So I can choose, if I'm in Spain, I can choose to continue to do all my studying through Spanish, or I do some of it through English. It's now in some contexts becoming obligatory, so that you need to do a certain percentage through English, or if you do a certain specialization in a program, you know, I don't know, I want to go to the tourism school, I need to do a lot through English, etc. So it's becoming more obligatory.
But Laura, sorry, let me just ask, so the language that is most used in, or, you know, in these, let's say, obligatory, you know, sessions or these, so it's English, not another language. It's basically English, right?
English, yeah. I don't know of any program that's obligatory that's not English. And it's still not, shall we say, a local bilingual program, because I've excluded, or I mean, distinguishing various forms of bilingual programs is tricky, and we could spend a day talking about it. Might not be the most exciting day of our lives. So kind of you have programs in Europe a lot of, say, in northern Italy, where the community is Italian and German speaking, you have schools that teach the other language. in some areas in Belgium where it's French and Dutch speaking, you have schools that teach the other language or both languages. They're excluded as CLIL because CLIL typically is identified as using a foreign language and not a community language. Because, yeah, kind of the one feature of European CLIL is that the L1 medium teaching continues.
Right,
so it's
right.
not like, you know, I think if I understood Professor Mustafa correctly, it's not like kind of in Nigeria where L1 teaching, formal L1 teaching stops at one point.
Right.
And then kind of, you know, it's yeah, obviously it's a community language, but it's not an educational language anymore. And then clearly in Europe, it will always remain. So you might have history through English for 3 months and then have it through German, right? So, and that kind of makes it slightly different. But of course there are, you know, overlaps and family resemblances. But if it's kind of really a foreign language outside of Britain, where it's French or German, it's pretty much always English. We have local kind of schools which sometimes call themselves bilingual schools, sometimes call themselves CLIL, depending, which would deal with Basque and Spanish in the Basque country, Italian and German in Italy, French and Dutch in Belgium, and French, German, and Italian in Switzerland. But they're slightly different because very often they're kind of, they have very different objectives, right? They're about kind of national unity very often, fostering community harmony, right? You want to be sure that the language groups speak each other's languages, right?
Yeah, which is important, right?
Yeah. But also interestingly, in Switzerland, they're now also introducing English as kind of a unifying language. Right?
Well, anyway, so this is something else that we should discuss.
And I think, you know, it will look differently in different countries. And I don't know whether in Brazil, you know, kind of how present is English in everyday life in Brazil?
No, yeah, well, actually, it's very much the default language for CLIL programs, and also there is a lot of debate here because in 2017 we had the publication of a core curriculum that declared English as the only obligatory foreign language. And in many ways, there has been a lot of resistance from the academic world, because in many ways reinforces this monolingual perspective that you know, it's pretty spread in the country, and we are surrounded by a Hispanic world, and in many ways, so this diminishes or reduces the, you know, it's already very difficult to have, you know, we had a law that had Spanish as obligatory during a phase of basic education, and then this law was revoked, which has caused a lot of you know, resistance, and then now we are, you know, it was a national law, and then we are having like initiatives, local initiatives to have Spanish back, because we, you know, but anyway, English is
it must, but Spanish must be kind of in the everyday lives of people with kind of all neighboring countries, must be very, very relevant, right?
Yeah, I mean, and in many ways, we are bombarded by the American cultural industry. And so, of course, people, you know, naturally will go for English first. But, you know, in many ways, this reinforces this what we usually call here this policy of coloniality, really, in the sense that, you know, the language, it is a, you know, a language that is present, you know, in the country. But, you know, we are trying to, you know, of course, this is the default language for CLIL programs, but, you know, the academic world is trying to, you know, to resist to this, because we are a multilingual country. And then, you know, the more we reinforce that idea, the worse, you see?
Yeah.
So then we have to, no, and then we have to go against that, you know, in a good sense that we have to teach, you know, all possible languages, including, you know, English. So that's the...
And I think it's also very, very tricky if you have language policies that pretend all languages are equal.
Yes,
because there are ecological spaces for languages, right? So for global communication at the moment, English has a really strong status that's probably not going to be challenged. But, you know, local, well, not just locally, but, you know, in large regions, other languages will be more relevant, possibly. And also kind of, I want to maintain heritage multilingualism, but I can't say, you know, I can't say I position a small heritage language in competition to English, because that's an unfair competition, and they need different kinds of policies, support, right?
Yeah, and that's why, for example, Brazil is still, well, let's put it this way, has over almost 200 languages, and especially the indigenous languages. So and if we don't really have policies to, you know, not only to support but to protect these languages, and so what's going to happen is that they will be pushed to the margins more and more.
And are the indigenous languages used as languages of education formally? Or?
Well, in some places, yes, but we could have more. In some areas.
Because I think that is also an issue, just a commercial issue, right? Because to foster local languages in education, you also need to have the preparation of materials, etc.
Yes. And they have to be used. That's the problem, Julia. They need to be used. And then, for example, the generations, so the younger generations, they tend, you know, because of Portuguese, which is the major language, so they learn Portuguese, of course, but then many of them just simply don't get interested in learning the, you know, the heritage language, which is very complicated. So this monolingual perspective is still very strong.
And it's very interesting because I've just been to Scotland, and they're kind of so there are a very, very small number of actually Gaelic speakers. I mean, minute, but kind of Gaelic medium schools are beginning to be quite popular, and they're not for people who have the background of speaking Gaelic themselves, but it's really, you know, a very English-speaking thing about, you know, national identities, etc. And it's very revivalist, but it's kind of course, you know, has a very different status from languages that are still thriving in the communities, right? And I think also kind of what you mentioned, colonialism is a big issue, right? Because in Europe, that is not an issue, because it wasn't colonialized as such, or most parts weren't. But of course, there is the issue of having local languages with long academic traditions that sometimes feel very threatened by kind of English dominating, not so much at school, but at master's level, right? And also
I see this happening. Sorry, I see this happening, for example, in the Nordic countries, or as you mentioned there, in the Netherlands. So this
and you know, kind of if you say, well, an academic language with hundreds of years tradition is then kind of stopped in teaching, that does things, you know, at university, because it does things about the communication between research and the local community. You know, kind of, which is already a challenge even if it's in the same language. And they're never easy answers, I think. But I mean, for me, I think kind of we really need to have different approaches and say, well, okay, what is about, you know, internationalization and what's kind of acknowledging ELF, and what does it mean to say, I want to give genuine support to local languages and to national languages, and kind of make sure that people feel confident and have the materials and the resources, right? Because you know, if people feel like, well, you know, in the worst situation, people feel my language is useless. That's
Yes,
not where we want to be, right?
I think this has to do with a question that we have there. Danielle, can you bring Kelly's question? She talks what Julia mentioned there. I think it touches the idea of social action. So
yes, I'm going to read. Hi, Julia. I'm going to read Kelly's question. She's watching us from YouTube, and
I think it's the last one because
we'll see how long I need. I try
it's
to
almost
be focused
time for Julia. Yeah. Okay.
Kelly asks, regarding language practices, how can we use Cleo to promote English language teaching aimed at social justice? I'm sorry, I read it wrong. How can we use Cleo to promote English language teaching aimed at social justice? I mean, practices for academic mobility, social mobility, since Cleo seems to be a very democratic approach.
Okay. Well, hi, Kelly, first of all. It's sort of, CLIL has an interesting tradition, I think, because the name itself and kind of its position was a reaction against sort of having other names for it in Europe, like bilingual education, bilingual programs, which were often associated with elite instruction. So CLIL aims at being mainstream, being open to all students. It has in the past been criticized that while it's still voluntary, then you tend to have a push of children from socioeconomic stronger backgrounds into CLIL programs with more parental support, etc. And kind of people criticize that very often, especially colleagues in Spain, so Adriana Patiño Santos and Eva Coro, have criticized that kind of CLIL reinforces this kind of looking at language as a commodity. So English is a commodity. I learn English because it will get me a better job. It's a really short statement. So it's got a problematic history, but it's at least been aware of the issue that it should not be, or language learning should not be an elite endeavor. What I think, from what myself, from my reading of the research, my own research, I found very encouraging is that, I mean, in Europe, in urban places, most classrooms are very, very multilingual based on migration of students in the classrooms. And a lot of CLIL teachers report that their experience of teaching their subject through a foreign language, when they are also a speaker of a foreign language, has highlighted to them the awareness of the role of language in teaching content. And that might seem, you know, kind of a really point 275b, but I think it is an important point, because for the majority of children of migrant background in European classrooms, and maybe also in other classrooms, a lack of awareness of teachers of how much language there is in teaching, and that maybe you can have very good language skills of the main language to have friendships and cope and understand, but the academic language skills are still missing, you know, what Jim Cummins noticed decades ago. This change of kind of not just saying, I'm teaching children who are not sharing the language that I'm teaching in, but I am teaching in a language that is not my first language, for many teachers has led to a reported really reassessment of the role of language. And I think that is something which can help foster social justice, not the only way to it, but I think a greater awareness of language, and not so much, shall we say, privileged languages like English, which in European context very much one of the top privileged languages, but also kind of more general awareness of languages, and maybe also kind of really discussions in terms of, okay, so a child who speaks a different language at home and is in mainstream education, what is an achievement in terms of coping with the language requirements? If I then have, you know, mainstream children who are doing studying through a foreign language, and then kind of, you know, what measures are we applying? So I'm not quite sure that answers your question. Kind of hope it does, but it's, if not, then maybe Kelly can ask back. I don't know.
Yeah. Anyway, but thank you. I think Pedepo, I was gonna say we have maybe 10 more minutes before we let Julia
We
go.
have 2 other questions, Savio.
Pedepo
Just
has
arrived.
a question. Pedepo, can you open up your microphone, and also Bolarinoa, if you have a question, so go ahead.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you, Julia, for that presentation. I really want to know, how can CLIL enhance the promotion of indigenous languages, especially in multilingual communities, say, for example, in Nigeria or in any other place, while we teach the English language? I heard you say something earlier on where you talked about a distinction between learning focused and production focused. You also mentioned the fact that the position of CLIL seems to position language just as a tool to achieve something else. Okay, so how do we encourage the promotion of indigenous languages while we teach, you know, content in the various classrooms using English language? You know, by the time you use English language and you teach English language as a medium of instruction to teach, say, biology, physics, and all of that, as time goes by, I think some of these languages will begin to fade out, like you already mentioned, or they become threatened.
Yes.
And of course, as linguists, we wouldn't want a situation like that. So how can CLIL encourage promotion of indigenous languages while still promoting the English language? Thank you.
Thank you.
I think it's a very important question, and it's a very challenging question, because I think sometimes it's really about trying to get 2 things together that are hard to get together, right? I think one thing where CLIL sometimes can be helpful is if you have a situation where you have a regional language that is strong, and that kind of wipes out in a way, or threatens smaller local languages, because then kind of the smaller languages would in a way have a more equal position. But it is something that I think has to be treated with a lot of care, in that kind of most researchers, and I agree with them, say that the first language needs to be strengthened before you can look at moving towards foreign language instruction or foreign medium instruction. And so that kind of to promote a kind of education and also ultimately foreign language education, the strengthening of local languages, so the languages that the children speak at home, at school, certainly kind of needs to be there, needs to be strong. There are also, we know, kind of big problems generally in transitions between primary and secondary, primarily also secondary and tertiary, but primary and secondary is a big transition in, regardless of what else happens. So there is an issue of saying, well, how helpful is it really to say, I make this transition harder by kind of removing linguistic resource. So the question is kind of whether stronger places would need to be there, right? It's very hard, I think, to say, can CLIL enhance promoting indigenous languages? I think that really depends what the status remains of these indigenous languages. So in the European context, CLIL is typically not something that is an immersion where then everything happens through a foreign language, but CLIL will be partial. And I think that can be something that can be helpful also in other contexts, to say, well, I don't move from the entire schooling happens in the L1. 2, the entire schooling happens through the L2 immediately. But I maybe have 4 years where maybe a few months the subject happens through English, and then it happens again through the L1, and a few months the other subject happens through English, so that it is something that kind of happens more smoothly, and I think that would give status also to the local language, right? I think the big challenge, the really big challenge, is to say, as a teacher, as an educator, I want what is best for the person I'm teaching, right? And that kind of is always a challenge in saying, okay, I want multilingualism to thrive. I also want to prepare this person for maybe an exam, maybe kind of demands at work, etc. So what I found, and I know too little about the African context and context with threatened indigenous languages, because in Europe, the indigenous languages are not threatened. They're actually very, very strong. But kind of, I think the challenge remains to say, I make sure that that there isn't a kind of too dramatic cut, that I kind of try to cope with a bit of mixture, which children and teenagers actually can cope with quite well, right? Because I know when I was working in the UK at university, people were always like, oh, we can't do our university classes in Spanish because they can't cope with everything in Spanish. And when you say, well, they could cope with a bit in Spanish, right? If you leave them exit routes, if you say, well, you can write your exam question in English in the first year or whatever. And I think such a mixture is something that might be helpful. But I think it is really dangerous to say, how shall I say, I put them in competition because they're competing on different levels. Maybe I say kind of language policy wise, the indigenous languages will need support because English has support already in the community. And then I really need to say, I need to kind of support the local languages and have initiatives to support the indigenous languages. It's like in kind of, if I want to equal the position, I need to strengthen the one that hasn't got support already, right? So if I'm in a position where I say, well, actually, English is seen by the community as something very, very much wanted, I don't need to fight for its position. I might need to fight for saying, well, actually, your children should have more instruction in the indigenous language. I know that in many contexts, you then have other conflicts which relate to, well, do then sort of some parents just say, well, we opt for private schools or private schools do something different, right? So that can be an issue, which in Europe is a lesser issue because private schools exist, but they're not, so most children actually attend state-run schools, right? So it's not so much kind of state-run schools basically can say, yeah, well, we do that, and most people will still go to them, right? So I don't know, but I think a really important question and one that has no easy answer, because I think at the end of the day, parents or teachers say, what is good for my child, right? And that many things are good for my child, and then it gets difficult, right?
Maybe, Julia, we need another session because it's about time for you to go.
Yes, I'm afraid so.
It is a great question, really, and of course we don't have an easy answer. So unfortunately, we have 2 more questions, but then we'll be there online. So then maybe you can check later, Julia, or I can pass on your
email also,
contact to people so then
I'm
they
happy
can
to
ask
take
you
emails,
directly.
yes.
But we don't want to delay you because you have another meeting.
No, I'm
now.
afraid I have to rush off.
So, but again,
thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the questions and kind of insights from other regions. Thank
you very much.
It's been great.
And maybe we can meet on the 17th if you have time. Yes. Professor Mustafa will be with us.
So and same time, same place?
Same time, yeah. I can send you the link, so then you can come back and then we can, continue with the conversation. So
Yeah.
before you go, we are going to take a picture.
Okay,
Danielle,
so
can
I
you
have to
do
look
that?
nice.
And while Danielle gets ready, I would like to thank you, Julia, again for this wonderful interaction and the great insights. And I'd like to thank our friends and colleagues from Nigeria, Professor Mustafa, who came and share, and also Pedepo and Bolarinua, and also all our friends and colleagues that are on the YouTube channel. Thank you very much. So we take the picture.
Thank you again for inviting me and for the discussion.
It's a pleasure, Julia, and I hope this is the first of several.
So I'm gonna count to 3, and then I'm gonna take a picture. Okay? 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay.
So thank you very much. Have a great weekend. And Professor Mustafa, we see you on the 17th. All right.
Okay.
God willing, see you too then.
Bye-bye. Thank you,
Bye.
Julia.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Bye.